Thank you very much, Kate, for the wonderful introduction, and greetings to all of you all over Europe and beyond what I saw. I give a short impression of the things we do here in our chair about climate change and about also trees and climate change. Historic gardens are very much influenced by climate change. Philip pointed it out. I hope I will not double too much of his ideas he shared with us. At first of all, I will cite the Florence Charter of E-commerce, which said the authenticity of a historic garden depends as much on the design scale of various parts as on the decorative elements and the choice of plants. It means plants are a crucial part of historic gardens, and the most important thing is not to replace plants, but to save the plants, to save the original plants in these gardens so that we have the original display, like we can see here in Sanssouci Park, which is wonderful old oak trees. Now, everybody knows in between about climate change, you can't deny it, and here is the famous design with the stripes, where you can see the average temperatures in Germany, in this case, rising more and more during the last 100 years. And so far, we were talking a lot about climate change, but now we experienced really the effects of climate change in the last few years. And from 2018 to 2020, all over Europe, we had the biggest drought events for 250 years. That means that we have drought in the soil. Here you can see the development of the drought intensities in the soil from 1952 to 2022, and you can see how dry it got in the soil, and we can see the effects all over, not only in historic parks. You can see it in the landscape. Here you can see the dying spruces in the Harz region, which is really a very crucial problem to the forest managers. But you can, of course, also see how it affects the historic parks. So far, we don't really know, we have no real knowledge how much historic parks are infected. Of course, we have some separate informations about that. Every park manager, every park director can talk about this, what really are the problems. For example, here Michael Rode for Sanssouci Park, but we don't need what happens all over. That's the reason why we started a so-called park damaging report here in Germany, so that we have more data to more know what's really happening all over Germany so far. And it's sponsored by the DBU, that's the German Environmental Foundation. And we have about 50 parks all over Germany, and we look how the trees there are growing, how the vitality of the trees developed over the last few years. We have only 1 year. We had 1 year now, so we have not really good data at the moment. But you can see here, for example, Schloss Diek. You can see in Schloss Diek how there are not all the trees are recorded. You can see the recorded trees, and you can see how the vitality of a recorded trees is decreasing. When you see it in that graphic, you see that about 30% of the trees are damaged so far. It depends on the species of trees. Of course, we don't know so far whether we have the same development all over Germany, but here in Diek you see that Tilia europea is less affected, and for example, other pseudomelatonus is much more affected. Of course, it's not only the drought, it's also diseases that come together with the drought and together with globalization. What we are interested in are, is it the old trees that die, or is it more the young trees that die? And normally you would suppose that the older trees are much more dying than the younger trees because they have a bigger vitality. That's not the case. We have obviously dying trees or damaged trees all over, also in different levels of age of trees. Here you can see it for Fagus sylvatica in Schloss Diek, and we saw it also in other parks all over Germany, that we can not say that the older trees are dying more than the younger trees. Yes, it has become obvious climate change will cause greater damage to historic parks. And what damage are these? How can we adapt historic parks to climate change? And what must change in garden monument preservation? That's the crucial questions. Now, impacts of climate change on trees in historic gardens. Of course, everybody knows about climate change. And, often we have only the idea that there's an average development, that the average is increasing, is decreasing. The average rainfall is decreasing and the temperature is increasing. But we have, of course, also a number of extreme events. We have a change in periodicity of weather events, and we have also a shift of seasonal phenomena. What do we have? Spring, drought and heat. We have extremely dry spring situations in the last years. That means that we have no water in such a beginning of a year, and of course that crucial, difficult starting point for the most of the trees in the parks. And of course, we have summer heat and dry periods. Here you can see one oak tree died very close to the river Elbe in Wörlitz, a very famous park of Wörlitz, where we have a lot of old trees now dying in that park. We will have, or we just have higher winter precipitation, of course, and we have mild winter. This means that we have plants that can profit from these conditions in the future. We will have a change in the composition of plant species in the future. And of course, these plant species, like here Tachycarpus fortunae, are an answer of nature to the climate change that is caused by human activity. We have longer vegetation periods. We have, but also late frost periods after mild and short winters. That's really a big problem, or will be a big problem in the future. We have a lot of these frost problems. So here in 2020, a late frost in June that causes damage on beech trees. And of course, we have storms, hails, and heavy rainfall. We felt it ourselves. We are sitting in a historic park, in a small historic park, and we lost 5 big old trees in the last 2 winters. So climate changing, significant change can already be observed today, but we have still great uncertainties how it will develop in the future. We don't know so much about the key factors. We don't know so much about the tipping points. So a lot of things will be uncertain what will happen in the future. How can we adapt historic gardens? How can we choose adapted woody plants for the future? How is it with change in historic gardens? I mean, you have to preserve historic gardens, and the question is, how can you deal with change? Here's a quotation I love very much from first Hermann Pückler, and he says, "We are never able to deliver permanent, definite work in landscape design as a painter, sculptor, or architect does, for it is not a dead, but a living. And like nature's pictures, our tool will always become and never be." So that's the basic for our work in especially landscape parks. But the change we face now is much more challenging than the change we had before. And so we had to go into new strategies how to redevelop these parks. I will especially stress woody plants. What can be used? What kind of woody plants can be used in the future? And I did here table with different options for the selection of climate adapted woody plants. You can take provinces of the area. You can take plants from local cultivation. That means you open your local nurseries, like some foundations in Germany do. You can choose climate adapted ecotypes. That means native trees from the margin of the distribution range. You can, of course, change selections or cultivars. I think Hendrik will focus on that topic. You can use, of course, alien species from neighboring areas. There's an idea of a so-called near natives. That means plants which grow very close to the place you are. And of course, you can change species from non-European areas. I just point out the idea of near natives. Here you can see regions in Europe which have similar conditions in terms of precipitation and temperature to what we expect in Germany in the future. So these are the regions where might be some woody plants come from. And these might be some of the plants like Quercus cerris or the Quercus pubescens, which might grow better than the tree species, the oak species we have so far in Germany. Of course, we have a lot of lists of so-called climate trees or future trees. Philip mentioned it, and that is one of the list we often cite here in Germany. That's a so-called climate species matrix from my colleague Roloff from Dresden. And he looked what plants are drought tolerant and what plants will resist the frost that is still existing. And he made a big list from plants all over the world. So that might be a possibility to select plants for the future. The questions, when we come back to the citation from the beginning, is the authenticity of a historic garden, because it depends how we just heard on the choice of plants and how many possibilities do we have to change some situations and to change the plants and to change the species and the person. And I think that developed very much on the function of plant has in the content of historic garden. Here I used a table formerly made by Mark Laird and tried to think about the design function of a tree, how you can do the restoration, how much freedom you have in species selection, and how necessary it is for climate change. So you have different design function like durable architectural structure-based framents, durable nature organic foundations. For example, in natural organic foundations, you have locations of an individual tree is not important, but the overall effect of the planting is. So you have good possibilities for compensation, and it's often necessary because because the native trees are in between failing. You have, of course, also an eye catcher function. You have solidarity trees. Here you have the replacement, and here you have limited possibilities for compensation, especially for symbolically charged individual trees. And here it's often necessary just to replace the tree you have or the tree you had in that case. So what I will emphasize that it's really necessary to look at the function of a tree or a woody plant or a plant, however, in a context, in a context or in a historical garden. Of course, there are much more considerations you have to do. I won't just tell them, but I don't will emphasize on that. To come to the conclusions, ultimately, this observation also that historic gardens and parks cannot be understood statically, like our works of art. Change is part of their conception that we have to consider in our minds. It's best horticultural tradition, and it come to our aid in climate change. But change must not be arbitrary. This is why creative minds are always needed to accompany this change and to make decisions that can guarantee a continuation in the best sense. And the last citations is one of the citations I love most. It's from the RHS from 2002, and it says, Britain's historic parks and gardens were mostly developed during a climate itself is becoming historic. Therefore, adaptation future will be unavoidable. If anything of original effects and layouts are to be conserved in perpetuity, changing and or more intensive maintenance regimes will have to be introduced, accepting the cost applications arise. So that's my last statement. Thank you very much for the attention.